Welcome to this lecture on the basics of neuroscience. Today, we are going to explore the Neuron Doctrine. If you have ever wondered how your brain processes thoughts, stores memories, or controls your body, it all starts right here. We will discover how the brain is truly built, moving from historical misconceptions to the fundamental truth of microscopic biology. Let us begin by imagining a massive, complex city viewed from an airplane. You might wonder, is this city carved out of one giant, continuous block of stone? Or is it built by stacking millions of individual bricks? For a long time, scientists thought the brain was like that single block of stone. But the truth is, the brain is much more like a city built of individual Lego bricks. These bricks are separate, distinct cells that communicate across tiny gaps rather than being physically fused together. Before we understood this brick-like structure, we had a very different idea. This brings us to the reticular theory, which was the prevailing belief among early scientists. They argued that the nervous system was a single continuous network, or a syncytium, where all cells were physically merged together. Imagine a giant web of biological wires with no breaks. If the brain were actually built this way, an electrical signal would just spread everywhere uncontrollably, much like dropping a stone into a pond and watching the ripples expand endlessly. To solve the problem of uncontrollable signals, science needed a breakthrough. That breakthrough is the Neuron Doctrine, the fundamental organizing principle of the nervous system. In the late 19th century, a brilliant neuroanatomist named Santiago Ramon y Cajal used a special silver staining technique developed by Camillo Golgi. Looking through his microscope, Cajal meticulously observed that the branches of neurons come incredibly close to one another, but they never actually touch or fuse. The brain is composed of discrete, individual cells, separated by microscopic gaps called synapses. Now that we know neurons are separated by synapses, we must ask why this separation is so critical. Because neurons are discrete units, they act as individual decision makers. When a signal arrives, the neuron can choose whether to pass it forward or stop it entirely. This discrete nature is exactly what allows for complex computations, learning, and memory. Furthermore, it allows for the targeted use of psychiatric medications that work specifically in the gaps between these cells. Without this doctrine, treatments for diseases like depression or Parkinson's simply would not exist. Understanding that neurons make individual decisions leads us to how they calculate those decisions mathematically. Because neurons are separate units, the electrical signal in a receiving neuron is simply the sum of individual inputs from other neurons. In this formula, V post represents the total electrical voltage change in the receiving or postsynaptic neuron. The sigma symbol adds up the inputs from n discrete sending neurons. The variable Wi represents the synaptic weight, or the strength of the connection, and V pre I is the incoming signal. If the connection strength increases, the total resulting signal in the receiving cell will also increase. Before we move on, let us see this formula in action with a concrete example. Imagine a single motor neuron in the spinal cord receiving discrete signals from 3 different sensory neurons. We are given the incoming voltage and the synaptic weight for each connection, and we need to find the total voltage change. We substitute the given values into our summation equation, multiplying each signal by its specific weight. This shows exactly how much of the original signal makes it across the synaptic gap. Adding the contributions of 7.5, 8.0 and 4.0 gives us a final answer of 19.5 millivolts. This physically represents the combined electrical change causing the neuron to make a final decision. Now that we have seen how a single neuron processes inputs, let us zoom out to see how groups of neurons interact. Because neurons are discrete units, they must form specific physical connections to communicate with one another. Imagine a small biological circuit in the brain containing multiple discrete neurons, where every single neuron sends exactly one-way connection to every other neuron present. This approach allows us to see how rapidly complexity builds when individual cells link together, illustrating why a brain made of discrete cells is vastly more powerful than a single continuous tube. To understand the sheer density of this communication, we use a specific mathematical formula. Since the nervous system is not a continuous, fused web, we must calculate the number of discrete gaps, or synapses, between the cells. For a fully connected network, where connections are one way, the total number of connections, C, equals n times n minus 1. Here, n represents the total count of individual discrete neurons in the circuit. The term n minus 1 is crucial because it accounts for the biological reality that a neuron connects to other neurons, but does not form a synapse with itself. Let us apply this network formula to a miniature brain circuit. We are given a small biological circuit that contains exactly 5 discrete neurons, and we need to calculate how many total synaptic connections exist. We begin by substituting the value n equals 5 into our network equation. Subtracting 1 from 5 leaves us with the number 4, meaning each of the 5 neurons makes exactly 4 outgoing connections to its neighbors. Multiplying these values together gives us a final answer of 20 discrete synaptic connections. This physically illustrates how a very small number of individual cells can create a highly complex communication network. Now that we have used this formula, let us understand the biological logic behind where it comes from. We start with n independent, bounded physical neurons. In a fully connected network, you might initially think each neuron connects to n targets. However, because these are discrete units, a cell does not form a meaningful synapse with itself. This self-exclusion means the number of valid outgoing targets for any single neuron is strictly n minus 1. This step perfectly captures the bounded, independent nature of cells. Continuing from our previous logical step, we can now finalize the derivation. We established that each of the n individual neurons makes exactly n minus 1 outgoing connections. To find the total number of synapses in the entire circuit, we simply multiply the total number of neurons by the number of connections each one makes. This gives us our final result. C equals n times n minus 1. This mathematical proof shows that as the number of neurons grows into the billions, the number of discrete connections becomes astronomically large, ultimately giving rise to human consciousness. To visually reinforce what we have just learned and proven, let us look at this diagram comparing the two historical models. On the left, you see the reticular theory, represented as a continuous, tangled yellow web of fused tissue with no breaks. Notice how a signal here would spread everywhere. On the right, you see the Neuron Doctrine in action. We have 3 distinct, separate neurons colored blue, green, and red. Crucially, look at the clear microscopic gaps between them, explicitly labeled as synapses. The small arrows show the one-way transmission of signals across these gaps, perfectly illustrating how discrete cells communicate. We have covered the full topic, so let us review our key takeaways. First, the Neuron Doctrine proves that the brain is not a fused mass, but a highly organized network of billions of individual, separate cells. Second, these discrete neurons communicate by sending electrical and chemical signals across tiny gaps called synapses. Finally, it is exactly this physical separation that allows the brain to process complex information, learn from experiences, and adapt to the environment. Every thought you have and every movement you make is a testament to the power of these microscopic building blocks working together.